At our daughter's third birthday party, my husband raised his glass and said, "I'm taking my daughter tonight and there's nothing anyone can do about it." He said it right after we sang happy birthday while 40 guests stood there with cake plates in their hands. My mother dropped her fork and my father started moving toward him, but my husband held up his hand. "Before anyone calls the police, you should know I have full custody as of this morning." I felt my legs go weak because we weren't even separated, let alone divorced. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say while our daughter Mia played with her new toys completely unaware. He pulled out a manila envelope from his jacket and held it up. "Emergency custody order. Signed by Judge Harrison at 9 this morning." My best friend Rachel grabbed my arm to steady me. "On what grounds?" she demanded because she was a paralegal and knew this stuff. "Unfit mother, drug use, neglect. It's all documented." He was lying, but he said it so calmly that people started looking at me differently. My sister Kate stepped forward. "That's insane. She doesn't even drink wine." But my husband just smiled. "Tell them about your prescription, Lauren, the one you've been taking for 6 months." My heart sank because I knew what he was about to do. "I take anxiety medication, prescribed by my doctor. You know this," I said, but he was already shaking his head. "You take 3 times the prescribed dose. You buy extra pills from your friend at the hospital. I have receipts." The friend at the hospital was my cousin who worked in the pharmacy. She'd never sold me anything, but I couldn't prove that. "Mom watches Mia crying while she's passed out on the couch," he continued. "I have statements from concerned neighbors." The concerned neighbors were his brother and his brother's wife, who lived 2 houses down and hated me since I'd reported them for leaving their dog outside in freezing weather. My mom finally spoke up. "I'm here every day. Lauren is a perfect mother. What are you really doing?" That's when my husband's lawyer walked in. I recognized him from the country club. Robert Pearson, who handled divorces for wealthy men who wanted to destroy their wives. "Mrs. Coleman, we need to discuss the terms of your supervised visitation." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Supervised visitation? I was starting to panic now. I haven't done anything wrong. My husband walked over to Mia and picked her up. "Daddy's taking you to Grandma's house tonight. Won't that be fun?" His mother lived in Florida. He was taking her across state lines. Rachel pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. This is kidnapping." But Pearson, the lawyer, stepped in. "I wouldn't do that. We have a valid court order. Interfering would be criminal." That's when my dad noticed something. "Why is your suitcase in the hallway? And Mia's too?" 3 suitcases were sitting by the front door already packed. This had been planned for weeks, maybe months. "We're leaving after the party," my husband said, still holding Mia, who was getting fussy. "My new job starts Monday in Miami." New job? He'd never mentioned any new job. He worked for his father's company here in town. The court agrees that relocating is in Mia's best interest, away from negative influences. He looked directly at me when he said it. Kate was filming everything on her phone, which made Pearson nervous. "Turn that off. This is a private family matter." But Kate kept recording. "It's my niece's birthday party. I can film whatever I want." That's when Uncle Paul, who'd been quiet in the corner, spoke up. He was a retired family court attorney. "Can I see that custody order?" My husband hesitated, but then handed it over. Paul read it slowly, then read it again. "This is dated today, but references a hearing from yesterday. Where was this hearing held?" Pearson answered quickly. "Judge Harrison's chambers. Emergency session." Paul smiled. "Judge Harrison is in the hospital. Has been for a week. Had a heart attack. I visited him yesterday." The party went completely quiet. Pearson's face changed. "You must be mistaken. Perhaps it was Judge Harrison Jr." Paul shook his head. "There is no Judge Harrison Jr. His son is named Michael and he's a dentist." My husband put Mia down suddenly. "There must be some confusion. My lawyer handled everything." But Pearson was already backing toward the door. "I need to make a call, verify some details." Paul held up the papers. "These are forgeries. Very good ones, but forgeries. The seal is wrong. The case number doesn't match the county format. And the judge's signature is dated when he was unconscious in the ICU." Rachel was already on the phone with the real police. My husband tried to leave, but my dad and 3 other men blocked the door. "You're not going anywhere with my granddaughter," Dad said quietly. My husband turned to Pearson. "You said this would work. You said she'd never fight it." Pearson was sweating now. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. Requested Dreads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. 2 police officers walked through my front door less than 3 minutes after Rachel made the call. The younger one headed straight for my husband while his partner moved toward Robert, who was still trying to edge closer to the hallway. My dad and the other men stepped aside but stayed close enough to block any escape route. Uncle Paul held up the forged documents and started talking before anyone else could say anything. He pointed to the seal first, then the case number, then the signature, while explaining in detail why each part was wrong. The officers listened carefully, and one of them pulled out a notebook to write down what Paul was saying. My husband kept repeating that this was all just a big mistake, and his lawyer had handled everything properly. He said it in this calm voice like he was trying to convince everyone that he was the reasonable one here. Robert tried to interrupt twice, but the officer nearest to him told him to be quiet and wait his turn. Paul handed over the papers, and the younger officer took photos of them with his phone. My husband's face was getting red now, and he kept looking at Robert like he was waiting for him to fix this somehow. Robert just stood there sweating and not making eye contact with anyone. The officer asked Paul how he knew Judge Harrison was in the hospital, and Paul explained that he'd visited him just yesterday afternoon. The officer made a phone call right there in my living room to verify it, and I could hear someone on the other end confirming that Judge Harrison had been in intensive care all week. My husband started backing toward the kitchen, but my dad moved to block that direction too. The officer told my husband to stay put and not move anywhere until they sorted this out. Mia was sitting on the floor playing with her new dollhouse, completely unaware that her father was about to be arrested. I wanted to pick her up and take her to another room, but I couldn't move. Detective Jeremy Walton showed up about 20 minutes later in regular clothes like he'd been called in from home. He had gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He talked to Uncle Paul first, and Paul went through the whole explanation again about the forged seal and the wrong case number format, and the signature dated when Judge Harrison was unconscious. Jeremy wrote everything down in a small notebook and asked Paul specific questions about court procedures and document formats. Then he talked to Rachel, who showed him her phone with the video Kate had recorded. He watched the whole thing twice and asked Rachel to send it to his email address right away. Kate came over and showed him her phone too, since she had the original video file. Jeremy asked her when she started recording, and she said right when Robert walked in the door. He watched that video 3 times, and I could see his expression change when he got to the part where my husband said his lawyer handled everything. Jeremy made several phone calls while standing in my dining room. I could hear him talking to someone at the courthouse and someone at the hospital and someone else whose title I couldn't quite catch. Each call seemed to make him more serious. He looked at my husband and Robert and told them both to sit down on the couch and not talk to each other. My husband tried to argue, but Jeremy cut him off and said if he didn't sit down quietly, then he'd be sitting down in handcuffs. Robert sat immediately, but my husband took another few seconds before he finally dropped onto the couch. Jeremy called someone else, and I heard him say something about forgery and fraud and possible kidnapping charges. My mom was standing next to me now with her hand on my shoulder. The party guests were still here watching everything unfold like it was some kind of show. Nobody had touched their cake in over an hour. Jeremy put his phone away and walked over to my husband and Robert. He told them both to stand up and put their hands behind their backs. My husband's face went white and he started saying this was crazy and he had rights and they couldn't arrest him without evidence. Jeremy pulled out handcuffs and told him the evidence was the forged court documents he'd tried to use to kidnap his daughter. Robert started talking fast about how he was an attorney, and this was a misunderstanding, and he needed to call his office. Jeremy told him he could call whoever he wanted after they got to the station. The younger officer handcuffed my husband while Jeremy handcuffed Robert. Jeremy read them both their rights in this flat voice like he'd done it 1,000 times before. He listed the charges as conspiracy to commit kidnapping, forgery of court documents, fraud, and attempted parental kidnapping across state lines. Each charge made my husband's face get paler. The 40 guests stood there in complete silence watching 2 men get arrested at a 3-year-old's birthday party. Jeremy asked if anyone else had video or photos of what happened, and 3 people held up their phones. He took down their names and contact information and told them someone would be in touch. The officers started walking my husband and Robert toward the front door. Mia looked up from her dollhouse and saw her daddy in handcuffs. She stood up and asked why the police were taking Daddy away. Her little voice was so confused and innocent. I felt something break inside my chest because how do you explain this to a 3-year-old? I picked her up and held her close and told her Daddy had to go talk to some people, but she'd see him later. She started crying and asking if Daddy was in trouble. I didn't know what to say, so I just held her tighter while the officers led my husband out the door. He looked back at us once and I couldn't read his expression. Robert didn't look back at all. Rachel was already on her phone before the police cars pulled away from the curb. She called her boss, who apparently specialized in family law, and explained the whole situation in quick sentences. I could hear her boss asking questions and Rachel answering while she paced around my kitchen. She told him about the forged documents and the attempted kidnapping and the arrest and how we needed help right away. Her boss said something and Rachel nodded even though he couldn't see her. She hung up and told me he was calling someone he knew who handled custody cases involving parental kidnapping. Within an hour, a woman named Victoria showed up at my house. She was maybe 50 with short dark hair, and she carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive. She sat down at my kitchen table and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. I went through the whole story while she took notes on a legal pad. She asked specific questions about my husband's behavior over the past few months and whether I'd noticed any unusual activity. I told her about the packed suitcases and the Miami job I'd never heard about. She wrote it all down. Victoria explained that my husband's actions had actually made my custody case much stronger because attempting to kidnap a child with forged documents showed extremely poor judgment and a willingness to break the law. She said we'd file for emergency custody first thing Monday morning, along with a restraining order to keep him away from me and Mia. She spent 2 hours at my house going over everything and preparing paperwork. By the time she left, it was almost 9 at night and Mia had fallen asleep on the couch. The party guests had all left by 8. My parents stayed to help clean up the mess of uneaten cake and unopened presents. Kate stayed too, and she sat with me in the kitchen after we put Mia to bed. My mom and dad were in the living room putting away decorations and wrapping up leftover food. Kate pulled out her phone and we watched her video frame by frame. You could see everything clearly. My husband announcing he was taking Mia, Robert walking in and talking about supervised visitation, the packed suitcases by the door, Uncle Paul exposing the forgery, my husband's face when he realized it wasn't going to work. And most importantly, you could hear my husband saying his lawyer handled everything. Kate had captured his exact words. She sent the video to my email and to Victoria's email and made 3 backup copies on different cloud services. We sat there in my kitchen past midnight going through every detail. Kate kept asking if I was okay, and I kept saying yes, even though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. My husband of 5 years had just tried to steal our daughter using fake legal papers. He'd planned it for weeks or maybe months. He'd packed our daughter's clothes and bought plane tickets and rented a condo in another state. And he'd done it all while pretending everything was normal. While kissing me goodbye in the mornings and asking what I wanted for dinner and playing with Mia before bedtime. I couldn't process it. My brain kept trying to make sense of it and failing. I spent Saturday and Sunday going through every financial record I could find. My parents took Mia to the park so I could focus without her asking questions. I pulled up bank statements and credit card bills and investment accounts. What I found made me feel sick. My husband had been moving money out of our joint savings account for 3 months. Small amounts at first. 500 here, 1,000 there. Then bigger chunks. 3,000, 5,000. By the time I added it all up, nearly $40,000 was gone, transferred into accounts I didn't have access to and couldn't track. I found paperwork stuffed in the back of his desk drawer for a condo lease in Miami. He'd signed it 6 weeks ago. The lease started next Monday, which was exactly when he'd said his new job began. Except there was no new job. His father's company was here. He'd been planning this escape for at least 6 weeks and probably longer. I found receipts for plane tickets. 3 one-way tickets to Miami dated for tomorrow. He was really going to do it. Take Mia and disappear to Florida where his mother would help him hide her from me. I took photos of everything with my phone and sent them all to Victoria. She responded within an hour saying this was excellent evidence of premeditation, and it would help our case significantly. Rachel came over Sunday afternoon with her laptop. She'd been researching Robert all weekend using her paralegal connections and access to legal databases. What she found explained a lot. Robert had been involved in 3 other custody cases, where fathers accused mothers of drug abuse to gain custody. In 2 of those cases, the accusations were later proven completely false. In one case, the mother had actually sued Robert for legal malpractice, but the case was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement. Rachel found online reviews from former clients, and half of them called him unethical. One review said he was willing to bend rules to win cases. Another said he'd suggested creating evidence that didn't exist. A third said he'd coached a client to lie under oath. Rachel printed everything out and put it in a folder for Victoria. She explained that this pattern showed Robert specifically targeted mothers with false drug accusations because it was an effective strategy that was hard to disprove quickly. My husband had chosen Robert specifically because he needed someone willing to break the rules. Someone willing to forge court documents and create fake evidence. Robert had a reputation for doing whatever it took to win, and my husband had found exactly the right corrupt lawyer for his plan. Victoria called me Monday morning at 8. She'd already filed emergency motions with the family court, and we had a hearing scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. She explained that the severity of the charges and the clear evidence of attempted kidnapping had convinced the judge to fast-track our case. My husband had been released on bail Sunday night, but there was a temporary restraining order in place. He couldn't come within 500 feet of me or Mia, and he couldn't contact us in any way. Victoria said his parents had hired a different lawyer to fight the custody case since Robert was now facing criminal charges himself. She warned me that his new lawyer would try to minimize what happened and paint my husband as a desperate father who made bad choices. We needed to be ready to counter that narrative with facts and evidence. I spent Monday and Tuesday preparing for the hearing. Victoria came to my house both days to go over my testimony and review all the evidence we had. The forged documents, Kate's video, the financial records showing premeditation, the Miami condo lease, the packed suitcases, my clean drug tests from my annual physical 2 months ago that proved I'd never abused my medication. Every piece fit together to show this wasn't a desperate mistake, but a carefully planned crime. Wednesday afternoon, I sat in a courtroom while my husband's new lawyer argued that the forgery was all Robert's idea. He claimed my husband was just a worried father who wanted to protect his daughter from my supposed drug problem. He said my husband had been manipulated by an unethical attorney and didn't know the documents were fake. Victoria stood up and destroyed that argument in less than 5 minutes. She presented the Miami condo lease signed 6 weeks ago, the financial records showing systematic money transfers over 3 months, the packed suitcases that proved he was ready to leave immediately, the plane tickets purchased 2 weeks before the birthday party. Every piece of evidence showed planning and intention. Then she presented my drug test results from my annual physical proving I'd never abused my anxiety medication. My doctor had even written a letter confirming I took my prescription exactly as directed and had never asked for early refills or shown any signs of addiction. Victoria played Kate's video for the judge showing my husband's own words admitting his lawyer handled everything. The judge watched it twice. The hearing took 53 minutes total. Judge Victoria sat at her bench reviewing Uncle Paul's written analysis of the forgery. She watched Kate's video 3 times. She read my doctor's testimony and looked at my clean drug test results. She examined the Miami condo lease and the financial records and the plane tickets. Then she looked at my husband and asked him directly if he'd known the custody documents were forged. His lawyer tried to answer for him, but the judge said she wanted to hear from my husband himself. He said he'd trusted his lawyer and didn't know the documents were fake. Judge Victoria asked him about the Miami condo and why he'd signed a lease 6 weeks ago if this was a sudden, desperate decision. He didn't have a good answer. She asked about the $40,000 he'd transferred and the packed suitcases and the plane tickets. He kept saying he'd been trying to protect Mia from my drug problem, but he couldn't explain why he'd been planning for months if it was really an emergency. Judge Victoria granted me temporary full custody with supervised visitation only for my husband. She said he could see Mia 2 hours per week at a supervised visitation center, with a court-appointed monitor present. She looked genuinely angry when she talked about the forged documents. She said forging court papers and a judge's signature undermined the entire legal system and showed a complete disregard for the law. She said my husband had traumatized his daughter and destroyed any trust that existed in his marriage. She set another hearing for 3 months later to review the custody arrangement, but made it clear that his actions had seriously damaged his case for any kind of shared custody in the future. 2 days after the custody hearing, Kate called me while I was making lunch for Mia. She told me Detective Walton wanted to search Robert's office and needed to know if I had any other information about him. I gave her everything Rachel had found online about his previous cases and the reviews from angry clients. The detective got a search warrant that afternoon and went through Robert's files with 2 other officers. They found templates on his computer for fake custody orders with blank spaces where he could fill in names and dates. There were 6 other case files where he'd created fake documents for clients who wanted to take kids from their ex-wives. One file had notes about bribing a court clerk to use real case numbers, so the forgeries would look more real. Robert tried to claim attorney-client privilege when the detective asked him about the files, but Detective Walton explained that privilege doesn't cover criminal conspiracy. Robert was looking at charges in multiple cases now, not just mine. The detective called me that evening to tell me what they'd found, and said Robert would probably spend years in prison if he was convicted on all the charges. I felt relieved knowing he couldn't hurt other families the way he'd tried to hurt mine. The next morning, my phone started blowing up with notifications. My husband's parents had posted on Facebook claiming I was keeping their granddaughter away from them unfairly. His mother wrote this long post about how she was a loving grandmother who just wanted to see Mia, and I was being cruel by preventing visits. Several of their friends commented with supportive messages about grandparents' rights and how terrible it was that I was punishing them for their son's mistakes. None of these people had been at the birthday party, so they didn't know what actually happened. Kate saw the posts first and called Rachel immediately. They spent the next hour writing factual responses explaining that my husband had been arrested for trying to kidnap Mia using forged court documents. Rachel posted links to the news articles about the arrest and the charges. Kate posted screenshots from the court records showing the restraining order and the reasons for it. Within a few hours, the comments shifted completely. People started asking my husband's parents why they were defending someone who'd forged a judge's signature and tried to take a child across state lines. His mother deleted her original post, but by then dozens of people had already shared it with their own comments about the situation. My father-in-law posted an angry response claiming we were spreading lies about his son, but that just made more people look up the court records themselves. By the end of the day, their social media campaign had completely backfired, and several of their friends had apologized to me privately for commenting without knowing the full story. 2 weeks after the birthday party, my cousin Sarah called me crying so hard I could barely understand her. She worked in the hospital pharmacy, and investigators had shown up that morning asking questions about whether she'd sold me pills illegally. My husband had told them she was my source for extra anxiety medication, and they needed to verify his claims. Sarah was terrified she'd lose her job or get arrested even though she'd never done anything wrong. I felt horrible that my husband's lies were affecting innocent people who had nothing to do with our marriage problems. I called Victoria immediately, and she told me to have Sarah bring all her employment records showing every prescription she'd ever filled. Victoria explained that the records would prove Sarah had never filled any suspicious prescriptions for me, and the investigation would clear her completely. I drove to Sarah's apartment and sat with her while she pulled together 3 years of pharmacy logs. She kept apologizing for being scared, and I kept telling her she had nothing to apologize for, because my husband was the one who'd lied about her. We took the records to Victoria's office that afternoon, and she made copies of everything. She called the investigators right there and explained that Sarah's records proved she'd never sold pills to anyone illegally. The investigators said they'd verify the records and close that part of the investigation within a week. Sarah hugged me so tight when we left Victoria's office and made me promise to let her know if there was anything she could do to help with the custody case. 3 days later, Detective Walton called my husband's brother and sister-in-law in for interviews about their statements as concerned neighbors. They'd told my husband they'd seen me passed out on the couch while Mia was crying, and he'd used those statements in the fake custody documents. The detective asked them specific questions about dates and times and what exactly they'd witnessed. Under questioning, they admitted my husband had asked them to say they'd seen me passed out, even though they'd never actually witnessed anything like that. The detective informed them that providing false statements in a custody case was a crime, and they could face charges themselves. Suddenly, they started backtracking and claiming they'd misunderstood what my husband wanted them to say. They said they thought he just wanted them to be supportive, and they didn't realize he was going to use their words in legal documents. The detective told them their cooperation would be noted, but they'd still need to provide written statements correcting their earlier lies. My dad heard about the interview from his friend who worked at the police station and called me laughing about how fast they'd turned on my husband when they realized they could get in trouble too. That same week, Mia started having nightmares about police and people taking her away. She'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night asking where I was and if the police were coming back. During the day, she followed me from room to room and got anxious whenever I was out of her sight for more than a few minutes. I couldn't even go to the bathroom without her standing outside the door asking if I was still there. Victoria recommended a child therapist named Lorraine Burke, who worked with young kids who'd been through scary situations. I called Lorraine that afternoon and got an appointment for the next week. The first session was just me and Lorraine talking about what happened at the birthday party, while Mia played with toys in the corner. Lorraine explained that kids Mia's age don't understand legal stuff, but they understand when adults are scared or angry and when their normal routine gets disrupted. She said we'd start weekly sessions where Mia could play with dolls and gradually talk about the scary birthday party in ways that made sense to a 3-year-old. After that first session, Mia seemed a little calmer, and Lorraine gave me techniques for helping her feel safe at home. We started the weekly sessions, and slowly Mia began acting more like herself again, though she still had bad nights sometimes. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom watching Pearson walk to the witness stand. The prosecutor had made a deal with him, and now he was testifying against my husband in exchange for a lighter sentence. Pearson looked older than I remembered from the birthday party, and he kept his eyes down as he was sworn in. The prosecutor started with basic questions about how he met my husband, and when they first discussed custody issues. Pearson explained that my husband had come to his office about 4 months before the birthday party asking specifically about emergency custody and how to get it without the other parent knowing. The prosecutor showed him printed emails and asked if he recognized them. Pearson confirmed they were real, and that my husband had sent multiple messages asking about what evidence would be needed to prove I was an unfit mother. One email from my husband listed ideas including drug abuse and neglect, and asked if those would be enough for a judge to grant emergency custody. Another email discussed the plan to take Mia to Florida immediately after getting the custody order. Pearson admitted he'd told my husband that legitimate emergency custody would require actual evidence and court hearings, but my husband had pushed back saying he needed something faster. The prosecutor asked directly if Pearson had suggested creating forged documents. Pearson said my husband had been the one to suggest it first, but that he'd agreed to help because my husband offered to pay him $50,000. My husband's lawyer tried to object multiple times, but the judge overruled him because Pearson's testimony was part of his plea agreement. The prosecutor presented more emails showing Pearson and my husband discussing exactly what the fake custody order should say and how to make it look authentic. My husband had provided all the false information about my supposed drug problem and the concerned neighbor statements from his brother. Pearson had taken that information and created the forged documents using templates he'd developed for other cases. The defense lawyer tried to argue during cross-examination that Pearson was lying to get a better deal for himself, but the emails made it impossible to deny what had happened. Every detail Pearson described matched the documents Uncle Paul had analyzed at the party. When Pearson finally left the stand, he still wouldn't look at me or my husband. The trial continued for another week with more witnesses and evidence, but everyone knew the outcome was decided after Pearson's testimony. The jury got the case on a Friday afternoon, and we all sat in the courtroom waiting. Rachel held my hand while Kate sat on my other side texting our parents updates. Victoria had warned me that juries could take days to decide, but this one came back in less than 3 hours. The bailiff told us the jury had reached a verdict, and we needed to return to the courtroom. My legs felt shaky walking back in, and I couldn't look at my husband sitting at the defense table. The judge asked the jury foreman if they'd reached a verdict, and he said yes. Guilty on conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Guilty on forgery. Guilty on fraud. My husband's face went completely white, and his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he just sat there staring straight ahead. The judge set a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, and my husband was taken back into custody because the prosecution argued he was a flight risk. I watched the bailiff put handcuffs on him and lead him out through the side door. Rachel hugged me in the hallway outside, and Kate was crying even though she tried to hide it. Victoria said this was the best possible outcome and that it would help enormously with the custody case. The sentencing hearing was shorter than I expected. The prosecutor asked for the maximum sentence because my husband had tried to kidnap a child and had abused the legal system. My husband's lawyer argued that he was a first-time offender who'd made a terrible mistake out of desperation. The judge didn't seem impressed by that argument. She said my husband's actions represented a serious breach of trust and an abuse of the legal system that could have traumatized a young child. She sentenced him to 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months. My husband didn't react at all when she announced the sentence. His parents were sitting in the back of the courtroom, and his mother started crying loudly, but his father just looked angry. The judge added that my husband would need to pay restitution for my legal fees, and that she was recommending he have only supervised visitation with Mia even after his release. As soon as the hearing ended, my husband's parents tried to approach me in the hallway, but Victoria stepped between us and told them any communication needed to go through lawyers. Within a week of the criminal conviction, the family court scheduled a hearing on permanent custody. My husband's parents filed a motion asking for grandparent visitation rights, which surprised me because they'd barely been involved in Mia's life before all this happened. Victoria explained that grandparents could request visitation in our state, and that the court would consider what was best for Mia. We had a meeting in Victoria's office to discuss how to handle their request. I wanted to say no completely because I was still so angry about everything their son had done, but Victoria pointed out that Mia shouldn't lose her entire paternal family just because her father had committed crimes. She suggested supervised visits twice a month as a compromise. Rachel thought I was being too generous, but Kate agreed with Victoria that Mia might want a relationship with her grandparents when she got older. After thinking about it for several days, I agreed to the supervised visits with strict conditions about where and when they could happen. 5 months after that terrible birthday party, I stood in front of a family court judge waiting to hear the final custody decision. My husband had been in prison for 3 months by then, and his lawyer argued that he should still get visitation rights once he was released. Victoria presented evidence of the kidnapping attempt, the forged documents, and the criminal conviction. She also had statements from Lorraine about how the attempted kidnapping had affected Mia emotionally. The judge reviewed everything and said it was one of the clearest custody cases she'd seen. She awarded me full legal and physical custody of Mia, with my husband getting supervised visitation only after his release from prison. The judge also ordered him to pay child support and reimburse me for the legal fees, though Victoria had warned me that collecting money from someone in prison would be difficult, and I shouldn't count on seeing much of it. My parents were in the courtroom, and my mom cried when the judge announced the decision. Walking out of that courthouse knowing Mia was legally safe felt like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in months. Lorraine called me in for a meeting without Mia to discuss her progress. She said Mia was doing much better, and the nightmares had decreased significantly over the past few weeks. Mia still got anxious around her father's relatives before their supervised visits and needed extra reassurance afterward, but overall she was processing the trauma in healthy ways. Lorraine recommended continuing weekly therapy for at least another 6 months, because processing this kind of trauma took time and consistency. I asked if Mia would remember what happened when she got older, and Lorraine said probably yes, but that the therapy now would help her understand it wasn't her fault. We talked about warning signs to watch for, like regression in behavior or new fears, and Lorraine gave me strategies for handling difficult questions when Mia got old enough to ask them. Leaving that appointment, I felt grateful we'd found Lorraine because I couldn't imagine navigating this without professional help. The financial situation kept getting worse despite the custody victory. My parents offered to help me refinance the house to deal with the debt my husband had left behind. We spent a weekend going through all the paperwork and discovered he'd taken out a home equity loan I didn't know about, in addition to maxing out the credit cards. The total debt was close to $80,000, not counting the legal fees. My dad talked to his bank about refinancing options, and eventually we got a new mortgage that consolidated most of the debt, but increased my monthly payments. I picked up extra freelance work doing graphic design at night after Mia went to bed to cover the ongoing legal and therapy costs that insurance didn't fully pay. Some weeks I was working until midnight or later just to keep up with everything. Kate and Rachel remained constant supporters through all of it. They came over for dinner twice a week and helped with childcare when I needed to work late or attend legal meetings. Rachel brought groceries without asking, and Kate started a college fund for Mia using money she'd been saving for a vacation. Having them around made the hard days bearable. 8 months after my husband tried to kidnap Mia at her birthday party, we were building something that felt safer and more stable than our old life ever was. Mia smiled more now and laughed at silly things like she used to before everything happened. She still asked about her daddy sometimes, and I told her he was away, but that he loved her, which felt like the right thing to say, even though I wasn't sure it was true. The supervised visits with her grandparents happened twice a month at a family center downtown, and while Mia seemed okay with them, she was always quieter for a day or two afterward. I continued taking her to therapy every week because Lorraine said consistency mattered more than anything else right now. My parents came over most Sundays for dinner, and my dad had started teaching Mia to ride a tricycle in the driveway. The financial pressure was still overwhelming, and some months I wasn't sure how I'd make all the payments, but we were managing. I was still angry about the betrayal, and probably would be for a long time, but I was also grateful that Uncle Paul had exposed the forgery before my husband could take Mia away. We were healing slowly but genuinely, and I'd learned that sometimes the worst moments reveal who truly loves and supports you. Mia was safe, and that was what mattered most.